Today we have a third day for our India's webinar series. I am welcoming you all. Before we start the session, before I introduce once again our renowned faculty, C.S. Shweta Milani Doshi, I would like to inform you that we are coming up with GST seminar, webinar series also. Due announcement will be made within today itself. So kindly join, share with your professional friends or your corporate friends. Now, I would like to, it's my proud privilege to introduce C.S. Sweta Milani Doshi once again today. She is a Bachelor of Commerce from University of Pune. She has completed his Chartered Accountancy in Pune itself. She has also is a completed Diploma in International Financial Reporting Standard by ACCA UK. She is certificate course on forensic accounting and fraud detection from our own ICAI. She has done her articleship from GD Upton Company, a leading CA firm. She is also consultant at FinPro Consulting, firm specialist in Ind AS. Presently, she is partner in Doshi RC and Company, heading internal audit, valuation, and Ind AS division. She has a vast training exposure as well as Ind AS exposure. With this brief introduction, would like to request CS Shweta Milani to start the session. And also we have our today we have Abhishek Shah, who is our co-organizer and also a branch at secretary at Navi Mumbai branch of ICAI. Abhishek, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Virak. So, friends, just wanted to highlight that we are conducting this seminar is on the third day, and we have already conducted around 5 or 6 webinar online through this GoToWebinar app. And now we are coming with various program like GST web series, bank branch audit, income tax, tally, and one more topic is related to how to present yourself in front of board meeting. So we are coming with various program in next 10 to 15 days. As you all know that Maharashtra has already extended their lockdown till 30th April. So now I request all the members to please join our Telegram group as well as Facebook group as well as WhatsApp group. And also I request that please ask your friends to join these groups, because we are sharing various knowledge, gaining knowledge materials there, and also various assignment, job opportunities on their this platform. So I request all the members to please join this group and ask your friend to join this group. So thank you. So I request Shweta madam to please start this session.
Thank you, Abhishek, and thank you, Virak. Friends, I'm Shweta Milani over here. So today we are going to conduct 2 important standards, which are Ind AS 116, which is on leases, the new standard which is applicable first time on 31st March 2020. After that, we will discuss Ind AS 12, income taxes, again a very important standard. In the previous 2 days, we have conducted various standards, we have covered various standards. So we had covered introduction, asset related standards, Ind AS 16, Ind AS 24, related parties, Ind AS 38, intangible assets, Ind AS 40, investment property. So these are all the standards that we covered. We also covered Ind AS 108 on operating segments. We also covered Ind AS 20, that was on government grants. So I hope you understood and enjoyed all these Ind AS sessions and you're well versed with these topics which we covered in the previous 2 days. I also tried to address all the queries that were raised. So today the main important topics we're going to cover from today, that is day 3, day 4 and day 5. The topics are very important. Financial instruments is there, consolidation is there, business combination is there. These are all technical standards which has majority of differences as compared to your Indian GAAP. So we'll start with the leases standard, that is Ind AS 116. To give you a brief background, previously under Ind AS, when MCA notified the Indian accounting standards, Ind AS, at that point in time, Ind AS 17 was released for leases. That was the previous standard, which was as compared with or a replica of IAS 17, which is a IFRS standard. So IAS 17 and Ind AS 17 were issued previously. Then IASB and the US GAAP bodies made a joint agreement or made a joint arrangement with each other and came up with a new standard for leases, which had a different point of accounting, a different pattern of accounting, a completely different logic used for accounting of leases. They gave a much deeper guidance given by these two bodies together, and it was really released universally or worldwide as IFRS 16. There is your ASC 842 under US GAAP, and similarly, even India adopted to this standard, that is Ind AS 116. This standard is first time applicable for the financial year 2019-20. So for listed companies, the Q1 of June 2019 was issued under the Ind AS 116 standard, and on 31st March 2020 will be the first complete financial year under Ind AS 116, which will be published by all the Ind AS applicant companies. So let's see, how is it different from the previous standard? What is different under this standard? What is the logic used for this standard? How is accounting different? It is said, you might have heard, accounting has totally changed under the Ind AS 116 regime. So what exactly is the change under this new standard, we will understand in this lectures. So we'll divide the entire standard into 3-4 parts. So firstly, we will understand what is the definition of lease under this new standard, and what all types of leases are getting covered under this new standard. Then once we understand what is the definition of lease, we will understand how to account for the lease. You might have heard we require the recognition of right of use asset. You might have heard through newspapers or some update messages or whatever you might have received. So what is this right of use asset, we will understand. What is the lease liability, we will understand. And thereafter we'll also understand what are the new disclosure and the presentation requirements under Ind AS 116. So moving ahead to the definition of lease. Before I go to the technical definition of lease, I would like to give you some examples over the situations that we usually come across in your normal companies, in your normal audit scenarios. So I hope everybody is able to see my Excel sheet also in front of you. For example, my first example, there is Infosys Limited, a software company. Infosys Limited has hired XYZ Logistics. XYZ Logistics is doing what? XYZ Logistics is giving buses for the travel of employees. So Infosys has taken buses from XYZ Logistics, and on yearly basis, Infosys pays certain amount to XYZ Logistics for providing buses for commutation of the employees. Now, what are the details? Infosys mandates the XYZ Logistics that the buses that Infosys selects, for example, Infosys has still selected 10 buses. These buses should be used by Infosys only. Infosys, the name of Infosys should be printed and painted on the buses, along with the head, the managing director, the CF of the company's images of those persons that should be printed on the buses. Second, the buses should address all the shifts of the Infosys. You cannot replace one bus with another bus without any kind of reasons. If the buses are not getting used during any of the shift, these buses shall be in the premise of the Infosys and shall not be used for any other purposes. So, in normal basis, how was Infosys accounting for these kind of contract? Under Indian GAAP, Infosys was purely recording the expenditure paid for buses as commutation expenses in the P&L and was debiting the expenditure account on monthly basis, on yearly basis. So, whatever was the rental charged by XYZ Logistics for the commutation, it was just getting debited to the travel and commutation account, and yearly it was getting expensed out. Now, this is the first example. Just keep in mind the example. Now we will understand what is the definition of the lease. Under this new standard, that is Ind AS 116, the definition of lease has completely changed its focus to the control of the asset. So whoever is controlling the asset should be recognized in their books. Who has the right to use the asset is determined under 116. They have given criteria how to define whether a particular asset is under a lease asset or it is not a lease asset. So it has more wider definition. We'll understand what is the definition under the lease. The definition as per the standard, I'll just tell you what it is as per the technical norms, and then again we'll understand by way of an example. The definition says, or Ind AS 116 says that there should be two criteria. The first criteria is there should be an identified asset, and the second criteria is the customer should control the use of the asset. What does this mean? There should be an identified asset means what? The person giving the asset does not have substantive rights to substitute the asset. To simplify it, you cannot easily replace that asset with some other asset. The asset is purely identified in the contract and it is not easily replaceable. It is not easily substitutable by any other asset. So it is an identified asset in the contract. Second condition is customer, the user of the asset, is controlling the use of the asset. What does mean? How will you identify whether the customer is controlling the use of the asset or not? The customer is receiving substantially all the economic benefits from the asset. So more than 90%, or I would say 100%, more than 90% of the benefits are received by the customer. There is no threshold given in the standard, obviously, but substantially all the benefits are getting received by the customer. And customer is directing the use of the asset. So how to use the asset, when to use the asset, how much to use the asset, what is the quantum of the usage, everything is directed by the customer. If all these conditions are getting satisfied, that is, it is an identified asset and customer is controlling the use of the asset, if both these conditions are getting satisfied, then the entire contract is a leasing contract. That means that customer has leased that particular asset and it falls under the definition of lease. Previously under Indian GAAP it was very simple. Unless the contract says that it is a lease contract, it was not getting debited as a lease expense. So sort of rent agreements, your lease agreements, leasehold properties were the agreements which were falling under the lease definition, and only these expenditures were falling under the rent expense. Nothing other, no complexity, nothing was given under your AS, under your accounting standards. But here they have given a guidance based definition. If these criteria are getting satisfied, then it is a lease and the entire contract has to be accounted as if it is a lease. You will later on determine whether it is a finance lease, operating lease, how to account for it, whether lessee should account it, lessor should account it. All these norms are the second part. The first part is whether it is a lease or not. So let's go back to our original example. In this case, Infosys is using that buses. XYZ Logistics is giving buses to Infosys. Can XYZ Logistics replace the buses easily? Today I gave number 1 bus. Tomorrow this bus is not available. I'll give some other bus. Day after tomorrow I'll give some another bus with another capacity. Can I do that as XYZ Logistics? Obviously no. Infosys has specifically mentioned in the contracts that only those buses mentioned in the contracts, they have mentioned the number of the buses, they have mentioned the painting style or the pattern that Infosys requires on the buses. Only these buses should be sent by XYZ Logistics, nothing other is allowed. So there is an identified asset. The first condition is getting fulfilled. Second condition is whether the customer, whether Infosys is directing the use of the asset or not. So Infosys is exactly telling when buses are required, at what time they are required, where the buses should travel, which bus should go to Kothurud, which bus should go to Swargate. Everything is defined by Infosys. When it is not available, when it should be at the premise, everything about the buses is given by Infosys. So it is as good as Infosys, the customer is controlling the use of the asset. So this entire arrangement, even though the agreement does not say as a specified lease arrangement, this entire arrangement satisfies the definition of lease and it is a leasing arrangement. So this entire contract is a leasing arrangement. We'll see the accounting later on, but first I understand what is the definition of the lease and which contracts fall under the definition of the lease. What will be the impact? Just let's understand on a brief basis. Suppose this entire contract is of 5 years, this entire contract is of 10 years. Then it might also be a finance lease. The life of the buses is generally 10 years, 9 to 10 years, and I'm having a contract of 10 years. It might fall under finance lease. We'll cover it later on, but I'm just giving you a hint what kind of impact it can change. Moving on to the next example. There is a company called as Tata Steel. Tata Steel has mandated or has asked Tata Power to set up a power plant in the premise of Tata Steel. So there is a power plant set up by Tata Power in the premise of Tata Steel. The Tata Steel mandates Tata Power that 100% of the power should be received by Tata Steel on a continuous basis. Tata Power cannot give the power to any other third party. Tata Power cannot distribute this power to any other third party which is generated out of this power plant. Whatever is the requirement of Tata Steel on a day-to-day basis, what is the power requirement for that particular day will be informed from Tata Steel to Tata Power, and that much power has to be generated by this power plant, which will be in turn transmitted to Tata Steel. So what is this arrangement? Is there an identified asset? Is there a power plant? Obviously, it is an identified asset. Tata Power cannot easily replace the power plant. Today, I distributed power from this power plant. Tomorrow, this is not available. I'll give it from some other power plant. It is not possible because of the nature of the asset. It is not easily replaceable. The asset is not of a such nature that it can be easily substituted by any other asset. The second condition, whether the customer, that is Tata Steel, whether the customer is directing the use of the asset, whether the customer is controlling the asset. How will you identify that? Every condition. Tata Steel is receiving 100% of the output generated by the power plant. These substantively all the economic benefits from the asset, that is the power plant, is getting received by Tata Steel. Tata Steel cannot or Tata Steel directs the Tata Power that how to give the power, how much to give the power, what methodology to use, what is the requirement of that day. Everything is directed by Tata Steel. And even if there is any other conditions, Tata Power cannot sell it to third party. Tata Power is not a distributor. Entire output has to be given to Tata Steel. So all the conditions of this and definition given by the standard is getting met. Forget the definition, even logically you understand what is logically happening. It is logical that, or it is in turn, I mean, the substance of the contract is that even though this contract might appear on paper that Tata Steel is just purchasing power from Tata Power, but actually the arrangement is what? The power plant is built for Tata Steel. There is no other purpose of developing this or building this power. There is no other purpose. So eventually, if all the benefits of power plant are getting received by Tata Steel, then what is this arrangement? Eventually, Tata Steel is not just purchasing the power units. Tata Steel is eventually leasing the entire power plant for its own purpose. So this is the second example. A very classic, I mean, the logic of this standard is very amazing. So just understand the logic of the standard. Let's understand the third example. These are the positive cases. I'll also tell you which definitions do not fall under the definition of the lease. Which are such criteria, if they are present in the contract, it will not be a lease contract. These are all the positive cases which I'm discussing initially. Third example, there is a company called as TCS. TCS has given cars to its employees. The MD has received Mercedes car, and such every designation of employee has been given a particular car. So what are the conditions? The owner of the car or the employee can use the car in its own manner. It can use it for bringing it to office. They can also use it for personal purposes. For any purpose, the car can be used. Repairs and maintenance are also on the employee. It is upon the employee how to use the car, how many times to repair the car, everything. There is no condition mentioned in the contract about the repairs and maintenance. It is as good as once TCS has purchased the car for the employees and employees using it, everything is governed by the employee, how to use it, when to use it, everything is by the employee. The TCS deducts from the salary certain percentage or certain amount for the usage of this car. Just as good as if it is a car of 10 lakhs, they might deduct some 20,000, 40,000 or 20,000 every month or whatever would be the amount. So deduct certain percentage from the salary. At the end, the employee has to purchase the car at 20% value is the condition in the contract. This condition might be there, might not be there. It is not making a difference. So what is this contract? Eventually, is there identified asset for that particular employee? Are they giving a pick up and drop service? No, it is not a pick up and drop service. The designated employees have been given cars from the companies which are being used by that particular employee itself. No other employee is using that particular asset. It is not like today I'm the MD, today I'll get Mercedes. Tomorrow if Mercedes is not available, I'll go through Tata Nano also. It is not that way. It is not a easily replaceable or easily substitutable asset. So it is an identified asset. Second condition is also getting met. The customer, here the customer is the employees. The employees are directing the use of the asset. The employees are controlling the use of the asset. All the economic benefits from the usage of the cars are getting received by the employees, and employees are directing the use of the asset. So all these three cases fall in the definition of the lease, and all these three arrangements are a leasing arrangements, in spite of the thing whatever it might appear on paper. In this case, TCS might show all the assets in its books as vehicles. TCS might just show that amount as deducted from salary as a staff welfare expenditure on account of cars given to the employees. So whatever the document might show, you have to go upon the arrangement, upon the substance of the arrangement. And the substance of all these arrangements is that it is a leasing arrangement. You will further go on to classification, you will further go on to accounting, that's a separate part. But firstly, it is an arrangement, that is a leasing arrangement. Moving ahead. So we discussed all these conditions. Let's go more in detail. So for arrangement to be a leasing arrangement, there should be an identified asset. The lessee or the receiver or the customer must substantively receive all the economic benefits out of the asset, and the lessee should direct the use of the asset. If all these conditions are getting satisfied, then the contract contains a lease. If all these conditions are not getting satisfied, the contract does not contain a lease. Even if one condition is getting failed, then the contract does not contain a lease. Even if one condition does not get satisfied. Now, we will also understand what is the substantive substitution right. This was one of the important condition over here. So substantive substitution rights is an important condition. Let's understand the details given about that condition also along with examples. So for the purpose of the condition of substantive substitution right, that is whether the asset is easily replaceable or not, there are two factors given by the standard. The first factor is whether the lessor, the provider of the asset, has the practical ability to easily substitute the asset or not. Is it practically feasible for the lessor to easily substitute the asset within the term of the contract? So in our example of Tata Power, can the nature of power plant itself is such that even if Tata Power may wish, he cannot easily substitute the asset. In that premise, there are not various power plants. It is not such a case that within that premise there are 3-4 power plants. Today I can sell from this power plant, tomorrow I can sell from that power plant. It is not that case. And the nature of the asset itself is such that you cannot easily replace the asset. Even in the case of Infosys, the buses cannot be replaced because of the conditions of the contract. So the lessor does not have the practical ability to substitute the contract, to substitute that asset. And the second parameter given by the standard is lessor benefits economically from substitution. Whether it is economically feasible for the lessor to substitute that asset, whether it is what kind of cost will the lessor incur. In case of the power plant, the cost itself of substituting the asset is so much that it is not economically also feasible for the lessor to substitute that asset. So these are the two parameters given by the contract, given by the standard, to identify whether the asset is substitutable or it is not substitutable. So if these parameters are getting fulfilled, you can conclude that the substantive substitution rights are not available with the lessor, and the definition of lease is getting satisfied. Moving ahead with the example that we discussed, now I'll tell you how a particular condition will not be satisfied what are such conditions or what are such examples? If they're not satisfied, then it is not a leasing arrangement. Let's go into the negative part now, which are not a leasing arrangement. For example, in a previous case, I'll just continue with our original examples. If Infosys had mentioned a condition that you just give me buses of certain capacities. So each bus should have a capacity of 40 employees, 50 employees. And you can give me any particular bus. Just I'm concerned that I should receive a bus at 7 a.m. in the morning. So XYZ Logistics can give any bus if it satisfied the particular capacity. There is no identified asset. Today I can give X bus, tomorrow I can give some other Y bus. So the condition in the contract is not specified to a particular bus, but the condition is specified to capacity. Capacity can be fulfilled by any number of buses. So in those cases, there is no identified asset in the contract. Since there is no identified asset in the contract, in that cases, the arrangement does not contain a lease because the first condition itself is not getting fulfilled. And this example is very practical example. Any corporates have such kind of arrangement. Your own companies who might be having pick and drop services through buses might be having this arrangements. So you can go back to your offices or go back to your clients and see whether the contracts are really containing lease or what kind of contracts are they into. Second example of Tata Steel. If Tata Steel would have said that you can give me the power, you can also sell this power to third parties. You can also distribute this power through certain Maharashtra distribution authorities. You can sell it to me also, or you can sell it to third parties also. So in that case, am I as a Tata Steel receiving substantially all the economic benefits of the asset? No. Power plant can sell the power to me also. Tata Power can sell the power to me also, and it can sell the power to some other party also. So I am not only the person or I am not only the customer who is receiving all the economic benefits out of the asset. Therefore, the second condition under the second part, that is whether the customer is receiving all the economic benefits out of the asset, is not getting fulfilled, and the arrangement is not a leasing arrangement because the conditions are not getting fulfilled. Now let's go back to our sliding example. There is a unit, again it's the same as the Tata Power example. There is a prohibition, there is no prohibition to sell the output to other customers. Since there is no prohibition, the manufacturer can sell the output to any other customers, and accordingly the condition of substantially receiving all the economic benefits is not getting fulfilled, and the arrangement is not a leasing arrangement. All right, I hope the definition is clear. Through this definition, we have almost changed the balance sheet of a company through crores of rupees. There was 2-3 companies where almost the impact was of 400 crores, 500 crores on account of simply this one definition. And since the criteria or since the contract was fitting into the leasing contract. So analyze this definition in a detailed manner wherever you're working, and this arrangement can result into the huge differences between the balance sheet of the company. So this was the solution about the arrangement. Since substantially all economic benefits are not getting fulfilled, that is why it is not a leasing arrangement. Moving ahead, I hope everything is clear. Wherever you have any kind of queries, just note it down. At the end of the session, we'll discuss all the queries. Moving ahead to accounting for leases. You might have heard that the lease accounting has changed drastically under the new standard. So what is this drastic change? Under the new standard, there is a concept of right of use asset. We'll discuss that concept in detail. There is a concept of lease liability. We'll discuss how to compute that lease liability. But the basic difference is previously under your Indian GAAP or under IAS 17, under Ind AS 17, the lease arrangements which are in the nature of operating lease were just off balance sheet leases. What does it mean? Only the expenditure spent every year on the rentals was getting debited to P&L. Nothing else. Nowhere in your financials any kind of accounting was done to reflect what are your pending obligations or whether you have a right to use a particular asset. Nothing was getting reflected. Only the accounting was done was rent was getting debited to your profit and loss account. Nothing else. So under this new standard, all the assets, including the operating leases, form a part of your balance sheet. All assets are on your balance sheet. How does it get accounted for? We will look it into we'll look ahead. So it is in the same manner how your finance leases are getting accounted for. So we'll just see how it is getting accounted. We'll discuss this impacts later on. We'll just see the accounting before. So what the accounting is, in case of the balance sheet or in case of the operating leases, you have certain arrangement or you have certain tenure of the lease. For example, I'm leasing a building for a period of 10 years. Every year my rentals decided are 10,000, 10,000, 10,000 for each year. Assume for a time being no escalation, nothing, to simplify the example. So every year the lease rentals are 10,000 rupees per annum, and this is what the arrangement is. So under previous GAAP, I used to just debit 10,000 to my P&L. But what is the substance of this arrangement? I am getting a right to use that building. I'm not the owner of the building, obviously, but I'm getting the right to use that building for a period of 10 years. Can anyone remove me out of the building for a period of 10 years? No, since I am into the contract with that lessor and I am only going to use that building for a period of 10 years. So I have the right to use that building for the period of 10 years. Shouldn't my balance sheet show that right? Since I have that right, shouldn't my balance sheet also reflect that right to use that asset? Yes. So my balance sheet reflects an asset which is a right of use asset. Similarly, since I have entered into the contract, I also have the obligation to pay the rentals for a period of 10 years. I have the obligation to pay the rentals. Accordingly, my balance sheet should also show the liability, the lease liability for the payment of the balance rentals. So conceptually it is, your balance sheet would show the right of use asset, which is similar to any other asset, any other property, plant and equipment. And your balance sheet would also show the lease liability. We'll see the accounting, how does it happen. So in this cases, as I discussed, the example is, I'm into a leasing arrangement. The lease will take a tenure of 5 years. I hope you can see my Excel sheet. So the tenure is of 5 years. The every year rentals are 10,000. If these rentals were escalated, if it was 10,000, 12,000, 13,000, 14,000, under Indian GAAP, you used to straight line these rentals. Okay. So this was what was done under Indian GAAP. What will happen under Ind AS? Under Ind AS, you will record for a right of use asset and you will record for a lease liability. But what is the method of measuring this lease liability and what is the method of measuring the right of use asset? The lease liability is accounted for as good as some other borrowing. So as good as some other borrowing, you're going to pay 10,000 every year. So this is how it will get accounted. You will discount this lease liability to the present value. Today on day one, what is the present value of my lease liability? So I will discount it. At what rate of interest, we'll discuss everything later on. So I'll discount the lease liability to present value. So in our present case, it is discounted at 10%. This is what rate we'll discuss. So the present value is 37,908 is the present value of the 5 years lease rentals. So my lease liability will be reflected at 37,900 in my balance sheet. My right of use asset will be equal to my lease liability. So whatever is my lease liability, my right of use asset will be of same amount. So my accounting entry that would be passed on day one would be right of use asset account debit by 37,900 to lease liability. So you have an asset in your balance sheet and you have a liability in your balance sheet by the same amount of the present value of lease liability. So everything is getting reflected appropriately. Your balance sheet is heavier in assets also and it is heavier in liabilities also. What will happen here in after? Right of use asset is nothing but some other, as good as it is some other property, plant and equipment. What do you do? How do you amortize or how do you depreciate some other property, plant and equipment? Based on the useful life over the tenure of the, over the useful life of the asset. Similarly, even the right of use asset will be depreciated over the tenure of the lease term. It will be depreciated over the tenure of the lease term over the period. It might be straight line basis, it might be WDV basis. That depends upon your method of selection of depreciation. So right of use asset would be depreciated over the period. What will happen to the lease liability? Lease liability will be bought to its original liability amount by unwinding of discount. We understood this concept yesterday also in case of government loans, which was at nil rated or concessional loans. So this unwinding of discount concept will come repetitive times in the Ind AS or under IFRS. This will come in financial instruments, it will come in government grants, it will come in borrowing cost, it will come in this leases standard. So unwinding of discount is nothing but the amount for which you had present valued it over a period, you have to take that value to its future value. So जो amount का आपने discounting किया था, it will reach to its actual value over the period by using the future value concept. Nothing, it is as good as some borrowing loan accounting, how do you do, or some FD interest accounting, how do you do. So over the period, I will future value these amounts which was present valued on day one, and on this basis, I will debit the finance cost or I'll debit the interest cost that is computed on the lease liability. So what will come in my P&L? So always remember that lease liability should always be zeroed at end. Whenever you'll compute the present value table, as I had discussed yesterday also, at that point in time itself, you compute the unwinding of discount table also. If there is anything wrong, if the discount table is not reaching to zero, you have made certain computation mistakes and there's some error in your calculation. So what will go into your P&L under the new leases standard? There will be no rent expenditure that will go into a P&L. Only the interest cost that was computed under this table of unwinding of discount. Only the interest cost on finance liability will be debited under finance cost, and depreciation of right of use asset will be debited under the depreciation head. So year on year, what will be your impact on P&L? So as you can see in my Excel sheet, the impact on P&L on year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5 is the interest and depreciation. Depreciation I've assumed on a straight line basis and the interest as per the computation on the lease liability. So as you can see the total, you might realize that in the initial years of the lease, the expenses are front loaded. What does it mean? You have heavier expenses in your P&L in the initial years of leases and you have lesser expenses in the later or in the end of the lease term. So expenses heavy on the initial years and lesser on the end years or on the last years of the contract. Compared with, I have mentioned a comparison also with Indian GAAP. In Indian GAAP, the rent expenditure used to appear on a straight line basis in your profit and loss. So every year, the 10,000 rentals was getting debited to your P&L, and every year the P&L was neutral on the amounts or was having the equal amounts. If you might have followed the straight line basis accounting. The straight line basis accounting was not, or under Ind AS, you had a criteria under Ind AS 17, the previous standard, you had a criteria to measure this escalation with the inflation rate. Only if the escalation is above the inflation rate, you are using the straight line accounting. But under Indian GAAP, you had pure concept of straight lining the lease rentals and nothing, no relevance of inflation rate was there. So if you're comparing Ind AS 17 with Ind AS 116, not every company might have straight lined the lease rentals. Just to give you a background about Ind AS 17 also. So if you might see under this Ind AS 116, it is a front loading of the expenditure. Total expense would obviously be the same. Even in case of Ind AS 116, the total expenditure over the tenure of the lease term is 50,000 itself. Even under previous GAAP, even under Indian GAAP, it was 50,000 itself. What is changing is the nature of expenditure. Here you have interest and depreciation. Under Ind AS, you have ROU asset and lease liability. Whereas under previous GAAP, you only had rent expense and no asset and liability. So this is the fundamental change in the accounting, which is there under 116 vis-a-vis the previous standard, that was your Indian GAAP or your Ind AS 17. So what will happen on account of this? Your balance sheet would be asset rich, as well as it will be more heavily dated. Your expenditure would be divided into interest and depreciation. Accordingly, your EBITDA would improve because all the expenses are going into interest and depreciation. So your EBITDA of the companies after Ind AS 116 would improve. Accordingly, if you see the financial ratios also, the financial ratios also have the major hit on account of this accounting because the balance sheets have become asset rich and obviously you have liabilities also. but the balance sheets are asset rich, and in the initial years, the profit after tax would be reduced because you have front loaded expenditure in the initial years. Compared with at the later years, your profit after tax will be reduced compared to Indian GAAP. So you would have the comparison over the tenure also. Your interest coverage ratios, asset turnover ratio, everything will go a change because your assets have significantly increased and the impact is significant. You find out any companies, any listed companies quarterly financial statements who are following Ind AS, majority of the companies, you go into the FMCG sector, you go into the telecom sector, you go under the construction sectors. These sectors have huge impact of this leases contract, and the impacts on the ratios is also very huge. Going ahead to whether there are any exemptions in case of this accounting. What are the exemptions? Should we follow lease accounting? Should we follow this discounting, unwinding for every kind of asset that we do? Today I'm renting printers in my office. Should I follow this lease accounting for that also? It will be very tedious for the companies. So there are exemptions given under the standard is, if there is a lease which is lesser than 12 months, then it is a short-term lease and you have an optional exemption. It is an option, it is not a mandatory thing. You have an optional exemption of not following the lease accounting for such short-term leases if it is lesser than 12 months. If the tenure of the lease is lesser than 12 months, then you might not follow the lease accounting for such kind of assets. And if it is a low value item, now low value item is a concept of materiality. Every company might have a different materiality limits for its low value items. There is no threshold given. There is threshold given under US GAAP, but that is not applicable to the Ind AS companies. So if it is getting classified as a low value items, so you might classify your printers, your photocopying machines under this low value items, and you might not follow the lease accounting for such kind of assets. Let's go into the further detail. There are various details involved under the standard. It is not as simple as it is appearing right now. You have definitions of lease term, you have definitions of lease liability also, you have further additions to right of use asset, you have decommissioning liabilities, you have sales and lease back, you have the subsidy, I'll discuss that in detail later on, in the upcoming slides. So there are various complications also involved under this standard. We can cover the limited complications right now, but if you go on to reading the standard in a detailed manner, you will understand the complexities involved in the standard. So I'll discuss the lease liability. It is a present value of lease rentals. So this lease rentals include your periodic lease rentals. At the end, if you might have given certain residual value guarantee, it includes such amounts also into your cash flow. At the end, if you might have been given certain purchase option, and it is very much certain that you will exercise the purchase option, the lease liability would include such purchase option also. Now, there are parameters given under the standard, but all should be included in the measurement of the lease liability. So all these, so in short, wherever there is a cash flow involved through the company, it should be a part of the lease liability. Now you would ask, at what rate to discount this present value? At what rate should you discount this lease liability? So there are two parameters given under the standard. If there is an implicit rate of interest mentioned in the lease contract, you don't know at what value the lessor has purchased the contract. You cannot compute the implicit rate of return on your own. Implicit rate of return is nothing but IRR. So if there is an implicit rate of interest mentioned in the contract, you will use that implicit rate. If there is no implicit rate of interest, then you will use the incremental borrowing rate of the lessee. So I am the lessee, whatever is the incremental borrowing rate for me, at that rate I will discount the lease liability. So this is the peculiarities about mentioning about discounting the lease liability. Moving ahead to how to measure the right of use asset. Till now we were on to very much basic that right of use asset is nothing but equal to the present value of lease liability. But what ahead? If you might have incurred certain indirect cost, you might have paid a certain cost for entering into the contract, stamp duty cost, certain brokerage cost, commission cost, any cost that you might have incurred has to be debited to the right of use asset. So today I've given certain brokerage to my commission agent. That cost also will debit to the right of use asset. It has no relevance with my lease liability that I've already paid. So that amount will be debited to my right of use asset. What if you have made certain prepayments, certain advance payments? Since it is an advance payment, it won't appear in the lease liability. It is no longer a liability. So that is why it didn't come up in the computation of the present value. So any kind of prepayments made under the contract would also be debited to the right of use asset. And the last part is restoration and dismantling obligation. This concept we have already discussed in Ind AS 16. So it is, and again, it is very much popular in any kind of leasing arrangements, specifically for buildings. So majority of contracts you might have read is whatever furniture you might have built in into your contract, that furniture has to be removed at the end of the lease term. If the contract contains such kind of clauses, it is nothing but a restoration obligation that the lessee has to incur, or the lessee has to incur the expenditure at the end of the lease term. So if you have such kind of restoration and dismantling obligation, even the present value of such restoration and dismantling obligation also has to be added in the right of use asset. The entire detailed concept we have discussed in Ind AS 16. So every accounting, the rate of discount, everything will be as per the Ind AS 16 concept itself. I'm not going to repeat the concept again over here. Moving ahead. So what is the conclusion, or what is the overall or overview of the picture of this lease accounting? So for the purpose of lessee, it doesn't make a difference whether it is a finance lease or operating lease. The classification test itself is removed for the lessee, because even if it is a finance lease, I used to make the same accounting previously also in your Indian GAAP. Now, even if it is an operating lease, I have the same accounting. So without any difference, with no difference, irrespective of whatever classification it makes, the accounting for a lessee is same. So you don't have to classify the lease into operating or finance lease for the purpose of lessee. Once you conclude that it is a lease, you have to follow this right of use accounting. For the purpose of lessor, still the definition of finance lease, still the classification of finance lease and operating lease exist. So lessor accounting has not undergone any change or any significant change in Ind AS 116. That is why we are not also going to cover in detail over here. So lessor accounting, the manner in which it was under Indian GAAP, exactly the same as there under Ind AS. What does it? I'll just cover it in brief. If it is a finance lease, lessor used to de-recognize the asset from its books of account, and that asset was appearing in the books of lessee. Whereas if it is an operating lease, the asset was appearing in the books of lessor, and the lessor used to collect the lease rentals. In this case also, lessor is not going to de-recognize the asset if it is an operating lease, and lessor is going to just recognize the income for the lease rentals. So understand what is happening now. In case of operating lease, lessor is also showing the asset in its books of accounts. Lessee is also showing the asset in the books of accounts. So this model or this accounting standards lacks consistency. There is no mirror accounting what is happening. Previously, there used to be a mirror accounting. If lessor is having asset in its books, lessee used to not have assets in its books. If lessee is not having asset in its books, only then the lessor was having the asset in its books. So there was a mirror accounting what used to happen. Whereas in the Ind AS 116, there is no mirror accounting what is happening, and the standard is lacking consistency. But obviously, there are other merits of this accounting. And this is the overview of the entire the accounting what is given under 116. Further, I would just give you a short definition of lease term also, because this has a significant impact. What does a lease term mean according to the standard? Lease term means a non-cancelable period. So if a contract is of 10 years and you have a non-cancelable period of 3 years, then only the 3 years period will form a part of your lease term, and all the discounting you will make over the period of 3 years only. You will not make the discounting over a period of 10 years. So I'll write it in an Excel sheet. So for example, if it is a non-cancelable contract. So if it is a non-cancelable, whatever is a non-cancelable period, only that period will form a part of your lease term. Now let's go on to the further complexities. Now, for example, the contract is having a period of 10 years, and in a period of 10 years, lessor can cancel the contract after 3 years, any point in time, and lessee can never cancel the contract on its own. So lessee does not have the right to cancel the contract, but lessor can cancel the contract after 3 years if this is the term of the contract. What to do in that case? If I am the lessee and I do not have the right to cancel the contract, what does it mean? For me, the entire obligation mentioned in the lease contract is my obligation on day one itself. So for me as a lessee, the tenure of the contract is 10 years and I will do all the discounting for a period of 10 years because I do not have the right to cancel the contract. Third case, what if it is other way around? Lessee has a right to cancel the contract after 3 years, but lessor does not have the right to cancel the contract. What will happen in such cases? In such cases, you will decide as a lessee, you will decide what is probable. Are you gonna cancel the contract after 3 years or are you not gonna cancel the contract after 3 years? So you will see what is the probability, and according to the probability of the contract, you will decide whether the tenure is 10 years or whether the tenure is 3 years. We'll take another classic case. For example, if my contract is of 3 years and anyone, lessor or lessee, by giving a notice of say 2 months, 3 months, can cancel the contract at any point in time. So lessor also can cancel the contract, lessee also can cancel the contracts, and these are the majority of the contracts, I would say. So both lessor as well as lessee has an option to cancel the contract after the period of, after giving a notice of 1 month, 2 months, whatever might be mentioned in the contract. Please note, such contracts do not fall in the lease term itself or do not fall in the definition of lease itself. Today also I can go and cancel the contract by giving a notice of 1 month. So what obligation do I have? Just a rent of 1 month. So as good as it is a short-term lease for me, and no lease accounting has to be done. So such kind of contracts which fall into the which has a lease term that any party, lessor as well as lessee, can cancel the contract at any point in time. No lease accounting or no such ROU accounting has to be done for such contracts. It is clearly mentioned in the standard. This is not any interpretation given. There are clear words in the standards. If either party has a right to cancel that contract, then this lease accounting has not to be followed at contract. Logically also it is the same. How will you show a lease liability for which you have at any point in time you can get out of that liability? So liability is only such that which is certain that you're gonna pay that amount. So over here, if there is no certainty involved, even the lessor can cancel at any point in time, then where is the certainty involved? Even as an asset, where is the certainty involved? How can you say that I have a right to use that asset for a period of 3 years? What if the lessor cancels the contract after 6 months? So that is why this right of use accounting and the lease liability accounting has not to be followed if either party has a right to cancel the contract. So these are the main important terms. I guess you would have understood everything in a detailed manner. I have covered every concept which is relevant and which is used in a majority cases in a very detailed manner. The other cases of the standard such as sales and leaseback is a very rarely used concept, and only such rare principles are yet to be discussed, but that is a very rare scenario. And for any further clarification required, you can obviously raise a query. So going further, if you are transiting from your previous GAAP, that might be either your Indian GAAP or your Ind AS 17 to the Ind AS 116, what are the options given under the standard? In that cases, what are the methods given under standard for transition? So first obvious case is you have a full retrospective approach. What does it mean? You have to restate every lease contract, you have to restate every contract, and as good as come up to a conclusion, what would be the accounting, as if you would have followed Ind AS 116 from the very beginning. So this is a complete retrospective approach. In the cases where you're following the complete retrospective approach, you will have to restate your comparative figures. Even your comparative figures would be as per Ind AS 116. So suppose the first year of application is 1920. Even my 1819 would be as per Ind AS 116. And whatever are the impacts on account of application of the standard will be given on the opening balance sheet date. So what is the opening balance sheet date in my case? My comparative year is 1819. My current year is 1920. and my opening balance sheet date is 1st April 2018. That is the opening date of my comparative year. So whatever are the impacts will be given as of 1st April 2018. You're restating your comparative year also, and you're restating your current year also. The second approach given is the modified retrospective approach. What do you mean by this modified retrospective approach? You did not restate your comparative year. You will only give all the impacts on the beginning of the current financial year. So whatever are the impacts you will give as of 1st April 2019. So my current financial year is 1920, and whatever are the impacts should be given as on 1st April 2019. And there is no the comparison is not appropriate obviously, because your 1819 is under the previous standard and your 1920 is under the current standard of Ind AS 116. But this is an option given to the users of the financial statements or to the for the application of this standard. So all the impacts will be given as on 1st April 2019. There are certain practical expedients also. Any standard, whenever a government issues, they give certain practical expedients. What does it mean? Certain practical difficulties, such as if a contract is already over previously, if a contract is already completely over, in that cases you might not apply this standard. If a contract is only having a balanced tenure of only 12 months, then you might not follow this accounting. So these are practical expedients. So only for 12 months, you might not follow this complex accounting. So these practical expedients are only possible in the modified retrospective approach. No practical expedients are possible in the complete retrospective approach. Because what does this approach mean? You're completely going by a retrospective method. You're following Ind AS 116 as good as from the very beginning. So these are the two transition approaches given. Some people also call our approach as a prospective approach. So don't go by the name. There is nothing called as prospective. Prospective means that everything will be applicable. Whenever you enter into a new contract, at that point in time, you will give the impacts. There is nothing called as a prospective approach. Any new standard can never be applicable prospectively. Even if the name of the approach, some people have just seen certain annual reports who use the word as prospective approach. But no such wordings or no such method is given under the standard. They have used just a different terminology has been used by them. All right, I hope this standard is clear to you all. And we have discussed this approaches also in detail. If you have any queries regarding this standard, then you can obviously note it down. We will discuss it at the end of the session. So now we will go on to the next standard, which is income taxes, Ind AS 12. Moving on to the next standard, Ind AS 12, income taxes. I hope everybody is well versed with the concept of deferred taxes, which is already used under the Indian GAAP. So we had a standard for deferred taxes under the Indian GAAP. So that standard had a basic, there is a basic logic about deferred taxes. Your accounting profit or the way you determine the accounting profit is different than the way you determine the tax profit. So if today I have a profit of 100 crores in my books, not necessarily exactly on 100 crores I'll pay the income tax. Under income tax, the method of deduction, the method of charging the income for tax, these are different methods. Certain deduction might be available today, but might not be available under income tax. Certain additional deductions might be given under income tax, which you don't record in the books of accounts. So such varied concepts are there for the purpose of income tax and accounting books. Now, if you want to match, today I give a profit of 100 crores, and if I'm not paying any taxes, I'm having a zero tax. Is it possible? And tomorrow I incur a profit of only 50 crores, but I'm paying a heavy tax because certain incomes was chargeable at a later point in time. There was a different point, there was different timing concept between the two, between the accounting and the income taxes. So what to do in that case? How will you match the tax expenditure with the timing, or how will you match the tax expenditure with the profit that is appearing in your books of accounts? So on account of such concept itself, the deferred taxes was brought in to eliminate this timing difference between the time at which income is chargeable to tax or between the time at which expenditure is deductible under the income tax. So in your books of accounts, your total tax The total tax that is debited to P&L is nothing but the current tax plus the deferred tax. This is the total income tax expenditure that is debited to the books of accounts. So in summary, what is the difference between the current tax and the deferred tax? The current tax is actual tax that you pay to the government authorities, actual provision for tax that is payable to the government authorities, and deferred tax is not an actual payment, it is not an actual cash outflow, it is just for the purpose of accounting matching. So it is just for the purpose of accounting matching. The basis of computing the current tax is the taxable profits and as per the applicable income tax laws. And the basis of computing the deferred taxes, you compute the temporary deductible differences or temporary chargeable differences. We will discuss this concept in detail. So it is as good as you compute whether it is a deferred tax asset or it is a deferred tax liability. The current tax is paid for the current periods. It is what, suppose if I am paying the tax for 1819 or 1920, it is the year for which you are paying the tax. Whereas deferred tax is for the future tax deductions or for the future tax chargeability of income that will arise. So deferred tax is for the future periods and current taxes for your current period. This is just an overview of what are current taxes and what are deferred taxes. So under Ind AS 12, the concept of computing the deferred tax is a bit different, or the language used in the standard is a bit different. I won't say that it is completely different from Indian GAAP, but under Indian GAAP, if you might remember, it was not strictly given under the standard, but practically when you apply the deferred tax, there were two methods of computing the deferred tax. First method is what you use, what certain people used to do. Compare the P&L items and compare it with the tax P&L. So compare your accounting P&L with the tax P&L and compute the amount of deferred tax. This was one method which was followed by certain, the one method of computing the deferred tax. So for example, today my expenditure appearing in my accounting P&L is 100, but it is not allowed presently under income tax. It will be allowed on actual payment basis. That is why I used to compare the accounting P&L of rupees 100, expenditure of rupees 100 with the tax P&L. There is no deduction available for this expense and accordingly there is a deferred tax. But in certain cases or certain second method of computing the deferred tax was the balance sheet approach. This was, this practically we used to use even when we are following the Indian GAAP. The amount or the result of the both the methods is obviously the same, but it is just a way of calculating deferred tax. Second approach was comparing the balance sheet amounts. If the closing amount of property, plant and equipment of fixed assets is 100 rupees under accounting books and the same is 80 rupees under the income tax books, then the difference of 20 is the deferred tax. So some used to compare the WDV of the assets, some used to compare the depreciation of the assets. These were the two ways in which you used to compute the deferred tax. Under Ind AS 12, the language used under the standard is a balance sheet approach. Due to this balance sheet approach, they have also given us certain additional clarifications, due to which certain additional transactions which were never coming up into the purview of deferred tax previously also fall into the purview of deferred tax now under the Ind AS 12 regime. So these transactions are same, there is no new logic applied, but due to the explanation or due to the manner of the explanation given, certain further transactions also get covered under the deferred tax. So under this standard, they use the concept of balance sheet approach for the purpose of computing deferred tax. So the first step that you do is you compute the tax base of the asset and you compute the tax base of the liability. This is nothing, it is similar under how you used to do under your Indian GAAP. We'll see by example. Don't get confused by the wording used. Once you identify the tax base of the asset and the tax base of the liability, you compute what is the temporary difference. That is the second step. Once you compute the temporary difference, you determine whether an exemption applies. So exemption is nothing but just a kind of a permanent difference. The permanent difference is what we used to have under the Indian GAAP. So determine whether the exemption applies and then you compute the deferred tax using the substantively enacted rate. And then you recognize the deferred tax in the books of accounts. And then what they have given under the standard is where do you recognize this deferred tax? Whether you recognize it in P&L or you recognize it in OCI or equity. We'll discuss examples for everything. Moving ahead. So this all we discussed. Tax rule is different than accounting rule. So the first step is in compute the accounting base of the asset. Accounting base of the asset and liability is nothing but how it is appearing in your balance sheet. So accounting base, you don't have to newly compute it. It is nothing but how it is appearing in your balance sheet. The basis of computing the tax base of the asset and the tax base of the liability is what is given ahead. How to compute a tax base of the asset? Let's first read what is technically given under the standard, and let's then understand by way of an example. Example would be very easy to understand. So tax base of an asset is amount that is deductible when the asset is recovered. So whenever the asset is recovered, what is the amount deductible? If the economic benefits are not taxable, then tax base is equal to the carrying amount. So forget this technical definition used by the standard. Even I don't use this technical definition. Let's go by an example. Very simple. If I have a property, plant and equipment, and which was costing rupees 1 lakh. It was costing rupees 1 lakh, and by accounting the depreciation, the WDV of that property, plant and equipment is 90,000. So what is accounting base? Accounting base is 90,000. In tax books, I have additional or I have greater rate of deduction or greater rate of depreciation, due to which my tax WDV is 70,000. So my tax base is 70,000. Whatever is the WDV in my tax books is my tax base. So my tax WDV is 70,000. Let's go by the definition. So by logic, you would also understand the tax base is 70,000. Let's go by the definition. What is the tax base of the asset? Amount deductible when the asset is recovered. So in the future years, how much is the depreciation that is allowed for you as a deduction? It is 70,000. So if you go by the definition also, the answer is same. Amount that is deductible when the asset is recovered. So the tax base of the asset is 70,000 because you will get the deduction of 70,000 as a depreciation in the future years. There is no disallowance or there is no portion of the asset that is not allowed as deduction. So that is the tax base of the asset. So this is how you determine what is the tax base of the asset. We'll go with another example also. For example, if there is interest receivable. If there is interest receivable in your books of accounts, the amount of that interest receivable is rupees 1 lakh. I hope you can see my screen also. The amount that is appearing in my books of accounts is 1 lakh. So my accounting base is 1 lakh, which is the interest receivable. Now, even under accounting, I have charged the 1 lakh, charged 1 lakh in my profit and loss. This is income what I've shown in my books. Even in tax books, the income is already offered for tax. So income is already offered for tax. Interest receivable is already offered for tax. So if economic benefits are not taxable when the asset is recovered, tax base is equal to the carrying amount. So what is my tax base? 1 lakh itself. So logically, don't go by the definition. If even in my accounting books the income is offered for tax, and even in my tax books the income is offered for tax, should logically a deferred tax arise? Obviously no. So logically also tax base has to be equal to the accounting base. So that is why the tax base would be the exact amount what is appearing as the accounting base, and there won't be any deferred tax. So deferred tax or the difference between accounting base and the tax base is 0. So go by the plain vanilla logics and this definition. Don't try to memorize this definition. We'll go by the definition and then determine what is the tax base and accounting base. Even logically also you can decide what is a tax base and what is a accounting base. Then moving ahead, what is a example we have already discussed, the machinery and interest receivable. So this was the same example what I did show you in the Excel. Moving ahead, how to calculate the tax base of a liability. We are already clear with the accounting base. Accounting base of a liability is nothing but how the liability appears in the books of accounts. At whatever amount it appears in the books of accounts, that is the accounting base of the liability. So just read the technical definition. I'll again show it by way of an example. An example is better than the definition. So tax base of a liability is carrying amount less any amount that will be deductible for tax purposes in future. Let's go with an example. Suppose there are accrued expenses in my books of accounts. Accrued expenses are of 10,000 rupees. So these expenses are not paid. That is why it is appearing in my balance sheet as liability. Under tax norms, the expenditure is deductible on actual payment basis. So unless you pay the expenditure, unless you pay the amount, it is not deductible in the tax books. So go by the, just read the definition again. So what is the definition? Carrying amount less any amount that will be deductible for tax purposes in future. So what will be the amount that will be deductible in future? The 10,000 amount. So my carrying value is 10,000. Less amount that is deductible in future is 10,000. So my tax base is 0. Go by the normal logics. If today I have debited certain amount in my P&L, it has been debited as an expenditure, but it is not allowed for the tax purposes, should a deferred tax arise or not? Obviously, a deferred tax should arise. So logically also there should be a difference between the tax base and the accounting base. So logically also the tax base of this item is 0 and there is a difference which is arised is 10,000. So as I am saying again and again, go by the normal logics. Even if you don't understand this definition, it is all right. So tax base of a deferred income is its carrying amount less revenue that is not taxable in future. So if you have a deferred income in your books of accounts, so if you have a deferred income, today I have a deferred income in my books of accounts of rupees 10,000. Deferred income, what does it mean by deferred income? Income which is deferred in the future years. Today I have already received the amount, but the income is not offered in my P&L and it is deferred for the future years. What is the tax base of such liability? It is its carrying amount less revenue that is not chargeable in future. So is it such revenue which is not chargeable in future? If the revenue is also taxable as and when you debit it to P&L, as and when you credit to the P&L, then in future years also it is not taxable in the tax books. So even for the tax purposes, the tax base will be 10,000 and the difference will be 0 for the purpose of deferred revenue. If it was of other way around, under income tax, the revenue is chargeable on receipt basis. As soon as you receive the revenue, irrespective of whatever you do under accounting, you do it as a deferred income, you do it as a deferred revenue, or you credit entire amount in the P&L, we charge the amount on the receipt basis. Then what is the tax base? Will any revenue be again chargeable in future? Today I have offered the revenue for tax because I have received it. I have offered the revenue for tax on a receipt basis. So will the tax authorities again charge it for revenue? No, obviously no. So less revenue not taxable in future. So 10,000 is not taxable in future. So the tax base is 0 and accordingly there is a difference which is arising, which is a deferred tax. So again I'm saying go by the plain vanilla logics. If a particular income is offered for tax in tax books and it is not offered for tax in the accounting books, so in that case deferred tax should arise, and even by going through the technical definition also the deferred tax is arising. So the plain vanilla logics are more better than the technical definition because you have to memorize where it is less, where it is not taxable in future. So the normal logics are more better. Moving ahead, once you determine what is the tax base of an asset and you determine what is the tax base of a liability, you will compare it with the accounting basis. So temporary difference would arise if there is a difference between the tax base and the accounting base. Now you will decide whether it is a DTL or DTA. Here also they have used complex language in the standard. This standard is logical, it is very simple, but the language used is very complex. So here the nomenclature used by the standard is taxable temporary difference. That is nothing but DTL, what we used to call under Indian GAAP. So taxable temporary difference or deductible temporary difference. Don't go by the formula of if accounting base is greater than tax base, then DTL, accounting base is lesser than tax base, then DTA. Don't go by such plus minus formulas. If in future years you're going to pay higher amount of tax, then it is a taxable temporary difference. And if in future years you're going to pay lesser amount of tax, then it is a deductible temporary difference. It is a DTA and it is a DTL. So go by the same logic is whether additional tax is gonna be paid or whether lesser amount of tax shall be paid or in the future years. So if lesser is gonna be paid, then DTA. If additional is gonna be paid, then DTL. I hope everybody is understanding, and if you have any queries, please note it down. We'll discuss it at the end point in time. We'll come back to these exemptions later on. It will confuse you all. So we'll come back to these exemptions later on, and first we will discuss the simpler part of the standard. Once you have computed what is the amount of temporary difference, then you measure the amount of deferred tax. The deferred tax is measured at an enacted or a substantively enacted rate. So in our cases, whenever the budget is announced in February or January, at that point in time, whatever is the revised income tax rates for the corporates, that rate you will use for the purpose of computing the deferred tax. So the computation has to be made on a substantively enacted rate, and deferred taxes are never discounted. So don't assume that everything under Ind AS is discounted, and since deferred tax is also a long-term item, that also has to be discounted. So deferred taxes are never discounted. Moving ahead, how do you recognize a deferred tax? Here there is a difference compared with Indian GAAP. Deferred tax liabilities are recognized in full. Always, in any standard you go, deferred tax liabilities are always recognized in full. Whereas deferred tax assets are recognized to the extent it is probable that future taxable profits will be available, which available to deduct this temporary difference. Now the word used over here is probable, whereas the word used under Indian GAAP was you have a virtual certainty. There is a big difference over here. Probable means more than 50%. Even if there is a more likely chance that the future profits will be available against which this DTA can be subsumed, then you can recognize the DTA. In under Indian GAAP, you had a very much strict criteria of virtual certainty for the purpose of deferred tax on losses and the carried forward depreciation. So at that point in time under Indian GAAP, you required management to give the exact forecast. You required the contracts on hand for the purpose of recognizing the DTA on the losses and the accumulated depreciation. Under Ind AS, you don't have any such bifurcation. On any type of DTA, you can recognize a DTA if you have a probability that future profits will be available. So virtual certainty is as good as a 95% certainty that you require. So as a proof, as an auditor, you used to require the firm contracts on hand that future profits will be available as a supporting for the purpose of recognition of deferred tax assets. That is why many companies used to not recognize the DTA on the losses unless there is a virtual certainty. Over here it is probable, and under Ind AS there might be cases where previously under Indian GAAP you have not recognized the DTA and now you have recognized the DTA considering this new definition or new threshold of probable given under this standard. Moving ahead, where to recognize the deferred tax? If the base item is appearing in the P&L, the deferred tax will also go in the P&L. If the base item is recognized in OCI, the deferred tax is also recognized in OCI. P&L is very simple. That is what you used to do in the initial years also. So in P&L, there was an item as deferred tax. But what about this OCI? I'll give you an example. For example, the gains on the fair value of investments have to be routed through OCI. This example I'm covering from day one. So the gains on the investments which are long-term in nature have to be routed through OCI. Obviously, this is an option. We'll cover this in detail in financial instruments, but I'm just covering as an example. So the gains are to be routed through OCI. Now, since you have a gain on the fair valuation of investments, you do not pay tax on a fair value basis. Under income tax, you pay tax on the actual receipt or actual realization of profit itself. So that is why there will be a timing difference. In your books of accounts, if the cost of investment is 100, you would have fair valued at 120, correct? And the gain of rupees 20 has been routed through OCI. It is appearing in OCI. Whereas in the income tax books, you have never offered this 20 rupees for the purpose of tax, and you have never offered this 20 rupees for the purpose of tax, and that is why there is a timing difference. So if there's a timing difference, you will have to recognize the deferred tax liability. Now, where will this liability be recognized? Since the gain has been routed through OCI, even the deferred tax will also be routed through OCI, and the line item will be gain on fair valuation of investments 20, deferred tax on above, say at the rate 10% will be 2 crores. So 20 will be the gain item, 2 crores of deferred tax liability will be recognized, and which will be routed through OCI. So if the base item is in OCI, the deferred tax will also be routed through OCI. If the base item has been credited to equity, the deferred tax will also be credited to the equity. The equity example will come in financial instruments. Now we cannot discuss unless financial instruments is over, but I hope at least OCI example is clear. Wherever is the base item, over there the deferred taxes should be recognized. I'll also show you any particular annual report. I guess on the day one also certain many participants were confused about how does OCI look. So quickly I'll show you an annual report so that you are more clear about how does OCI looks. Because I had various queries on the OCI component. So I'll just quickly show you so that you have clear understanding over it. I hope you can see my screen. I've just opened the annual report of Praj Industries Limited. We'll just go to the, we'll just see the P&L format and how does OCI look, so it is very much clear for you. So can you see the profit and loss in your on your screen? So if you can see the profit and loss, at the initial stages, normal it is income, revenue from operations, expenses, you have profit before taxes, you have tax expenditure, you have profit for the year. Till here, everything is same, there is no change. But after that, there is other comprehensive income. It is statement below the statement of profit and loss. In other comprehensive income, they have specified certain items which will be routed through other comprehensive income. You don't have choice. There are certain listed items. Only these items should be routed through the other comprehensive income. One of that item is remeasurement of defined benefit plan. So it is nothing but the actual gain or loss on the defined benefit plan. So any kind of actual gain or loss on your defined benefit plan has to be routed through the other comprehensive income. So over here, the Praj Industries Limited has disclosed this item in OCI. So there was a gain of 6.83 million. Alright, it is a gain appearing in OCI. Income tax effect. There is a deferred tax created on the gratuity obligation. Correct? You create a deferred tax because under income tax it is deductible on payment basis, whereas you debit the P&L. That is why there is a deferred tax which arises. So even the deferred tax on this particular item will be recognized in the other comprehensive income itself. So you can see the item of income tax effect. This is nothing but the deferred tax, which is also recognized in the other comprehensive income. So net is 4.44 million, and the total comprehensive income is nothing but the profit after tax plus the other comprehensive income is equal to the total comprehensive income. And your EPS is never computed on total comprehensive income. EPS is always computed on the profit for the year. So as I said, the logic for OCI was to route such kind of items which should not make your P&L more volatile. It should not impact your normal P&L. That is why even the EPS is also computed on the profit for the year, and the components of OCI or the amount recognized in OCI is never considered for the purpose of computing the EPS. I hope it has given a bit more fair idea for you, for the people who didn't understand the OCI concept on day one. If you still have further queries, we can discuss it in person. Moving ahead, special considerations. Now pay full attention over here because till now whatever we discussed was similar as to what is there under Indian GAAP, bearing very few changes. But now the special considerations are such cases which were never there under Indian GAAP. So let's discuss with the first concept of deferred tax arising in books and reversing in books. Let's understand this difference. Now, if you might have heard in this 2-3 sessions, there is a lot of discounting and unwinding of discount which is happening under this Ind AS regime. So there's a lot of discounting and unwinding happening. Under income tax, never such kind of accounting entries will be deductible or chargeable to tax. You recognize something as finance cost, these expenditures are not deductible under income tax. So what do you do? So let's take an example. For example, as we had discussed, there is a provision of rupees 10,000. If there is a provision of rupees 10,000, assume for a timing this is never allowed in tax. Even on payment basis, on whatever basis, this is not allowed in tax. This is the assumption what you have to take for a timing. If it is never allowed in tax, what you used to do under Indian GAAP? If a particular item is never deductible in tax purposes, it was a permanent difference and no deferred tax was ever recognized on that particular item. So this used to fall under the permanent difference criteria. But now under Ind AS, any provisions which are long-term in nature has to be discounted to the present value. So this provision was discounted using the risk-free rate of return and the present value of the provision is 7,100. Now, today on day 1, the provision appearing in your books of accounts is 7,100. This is never deductible in tax purposes, so comparison with tax is not required also. But understand, today the provision is appearing at 7,100, correct? Over a period, you will debit the finance cost, correct? You are going to debit the finance cost over the period. So this is the amount or this is the income. Today it is arising in the books. And today you're getting an income of 2,900, which is the difference between the provisions. So today the income is arising of 2,800. Over a period, this 2,800 you will recognize as a finance expenditure. So what does it mean? Today you're showing an income of 2,800 and over a period you will again debit this and neutralize this income by finance cost. So this is what income arising in the books, which will get nullified by finance cost, which will be debited to P&L in the future years. So this is nothing but on these components also. Today you're recognizing an income in your books. So since you're recognizing an income in the books, you should recognize a DTL on day 1. Just understand the complete example first. Okay, as and when this income will get reversed, you will recognize DTA in your books to match the income and expenditure over the period. This is such kind of deferred tax which will arise in the books and reverse in the books. There is no cognizance or no reference to the income taxes. We'll also discuss the further examples also, then you'll understand how only within the books you're recognizing the deferred tax. So since you recognize the gain of today, you will recognize the detail on such component. And in the further years, as and when you will recognize the finance cost, at that point in time, you will recognize the DTA on such items. We'll discuss the next example. Now, if you are aware about the consolidated financial statements, today I am the holding company. Holding company is selling certain goods to the subsidiary company. So I'm selling certain goods to the company, to the subsidiary company. The cost of such goods is 1,000 rupees to me. I am selling that goods to the subsidiary company at rupees 1,500. Okay, 500 is my own margin. But the subsidiary has not yet sold the goods to the third party in the market. So in my consolidated financial statements, this transaction or the unrealized portion on the inventory will be reversed. So for the group as a whole, the 500 rupees of income which has arisen from the sale of the holding company to the subsidiary company is not really an income. It is income within the group itself. So that is why you will realize or you will reverse this unrealized profit on inventory. So this is the adjustment that you make on the consolidated financial statements. This adjustment was there in the Indian GAAP also, no change. In any GAAP, you reverse the unrealized profits in the consolidated financial statements. Now let's understand the deferred tax principles. So for the purpose of deferred tax, what are the principles? Now tell me, when the subsidiary or when the holding company sold the goods to the subsidiary company costing rupees 1000 at rupees 1500, the holding company has paid tax on rupees 500. So whatever the income the holding company has earned, the holding company has paid the tax on that in their taxable P&L. Am I correct? If in the consolidated financial statements, if you are reversing this income, so you have reversed the income in the CFS. So in CFS, what is the scenario? There is no income, but there is a tax. Since you have paid that current tax, since the holding company has paid that current tax, there is no income, but there is a current tax. Is the matching concept getting fulfilled? No, obviously it is not getting fulfilled. In CFS, you don't have the income, but you have a current tax. So that is why on this unrealized profit, you recognize a deferred tax asset. You recognize a deductible temporary difference on this item. So what is that the case? You recognize a DTA in only in the consolidated financial statements. So there is no impact. There is no cognizance of comparing this with the tax P&L or nothing. You don't pay tax as per CFS. You pay tax as per standalone financial statements. But what is this? What is this scenario? This transaction is arising in the books. Today you don't have the income, but you have paid the current tax on that. In the next year, what will happen? In the year 2, when the subsidiary will sell the goods. When the subsidiary will sell the goods, you will realize or you will realize the profit in the CFS. Whatever profit even the holding company had made of rupees 500, that you will realize in CFS, you will recognize in CFS. So now in year 2, what is the scenario in CFS? In year 2, there is an income in CFS, but holding company has already paid the tax in last year. Again in current year, nobody is going to pay tax on this rupees 500. So there is income, but there is no tax. So this was the scenario what was happening under the Indian GAAP. So under Ind AS, even on such transaction, you will recognize a deferred tax. In year 1, you will recognize DTA. Whereas in year 2, or whenever the subsidiary will sell that goods, in that year you will reverse this DTA. In short, you will recognize the expenditure. Please note, to understand these concepts, your Indian GAAP deferred tax concepts should be very clear. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to understand these concepts. So this is the case that you recognize DTA in year 1 when you reverse the unrealized profit. And as soon as you recognize this unrealized profit, you will reverse this DTA, and there would be a matching concept. So this is again a second example of deferred tax which is arising in the books of accounts and which is getting reversed in the books of accounts. There is no concept of matching it with what is happening under the income tax. I hope it is clear to you all. Now moving on to the next concept. For example, if you are holding company in India, which is taxable at tax rate of rupees 25 or 25%. Your subsidiary is a US subsidiary where the tax rate is, for example, it is 35%. At what rate will you recognize the deferred tax? When you recognize the deferred tax on this unrealized profit, what will be the tax rate that you will use? The tax rate should be the rate at which the subsidiary is going to pay the tax. The rate at which the subsidiary is going to pay the tax should be the tax rate used for the purpose of computing this deferred tax. What is the logic over this? And the logic over this is the subsidiary is gonna, whenever the subsidiary is gonna make the transaction, at that point in time you're gonna recognize the entire income. So that is why the subsidiary's deferred tax rate, subsidiary's income tax rate will be used for the purpose of computing the deferred tax. Moving ahead to another example. I hope these two examples are clear. I agree it is a bit difficult or a bit difficult concept to digest, but please understand it step by step. The third concept, investment in subsidiaries, associates and joint ventures. Understand just as a concept and we'll understand it in detail with what the standard says. For example, today I have made an investment in the holding company has made an investment in a 100% subsidiary company of rupees 1,000. Okay, and the holding company has made an investment of rupees 1,000. Over the years, subsidiary company has made a profit of rupees 500. In your consolidated financial statements, your total reserves and surplus are appearing as 1,500. Okay, your total reserves and surplus of the subsidiary is appearing at 1,500, or as good as your investment value is appearing at 1,500. So investment value is what? The cost of the investment plus the gains or plus the profits made by the subsidiary. Now tell me, are these realized profits for you? Whenever the subsidiary is going to declare a dividend or whatever it will say, it will be actual cash profits for you. But as on today, are they realized profits for you? Do you have that profits in hand? No. So the tax base of this investment is 1,000 itself in your tax books. But whereas in the accounting books, the value of this investment is 1,500. There is again a difference which is arising between the accounting books and the tax books. So what does it mean? As good as in your books of accounts, when you show your CFS or when you show your investment value at 1,500, what does it mean? Your books of value is showing that value as 1,500. You have a value of investment of 1,500. Whereas in tax books, you are still having a value of 1,000 only. So over here also there is a deferred tax liability which is getting arised. On these gains, as and when you make the gain, as and when the subsidiary makes the gain and you consolidate it in your CFS, there is a liability which is getting arised, because as soon as you're making the CFS, it is as good as in your accounting books, it is your own profit. But has the subsidiary declared a dividend, or have you sold a subsidiary and realized that profit? No. Then how are you showing the value as 1,500? There is a difference which is arising. Okay, but what to do of this difference? The standard says that if in such cases, the standard has specifically mentioned these cases, you do not recognize the DTL if you're controlling the timing of reversal. If you're controlling the timing of reversal, then you do not recognize the DTL. This is the first condition. And the second condition is that the probability of the deferred tax, the probability of the temporary difference getting reversed is not in the foreseeable future. In the foreseeable future, it is not probable that the temporary difference will get reversed. Let's see in the example. So in this cases, the standard is also agreeing that the DTL is getting arised, but the standard has given an exemption. If you are controlling the timing of reversal, what do you mean by control? If it is your subsidiary, if you're controlling the timing of reversal, and the second case is probability that the temporary differences will reverse in the foreseeable future is not there. You don't have any probability that the difference will reverse in the foreseeable future. What does it mean? There is no probability that you will sell off the subsidiary in the near future, or there is no probability that the subsidiary will declare dividends in the near future. How are you going to realize? Either by dividend or by sale of subsidiary. So the probability that subsidiary will either declare a dividend or you are going to sell off the subsidiary is not there. If these two conditions are getting satisfied, then you are allowed to not recognize this detail in your books of accounts. So this is a higher level concept. Just understand it step by step. If both these conditions are getting satisfied, then the deferred tax liability is not to be recognized. Let's go on to the further cases. Then when will the detail be recognized? For example, in your board resolution, the board has decided that in the next year, the board is gonna disinvest from this subsidiary company. So there are talks going on in the companies, or there are certain strategic decisions what are happening in the company, that the company is going to reduce investment from this subsidiary company. So what is the case? In the near future, the differences are going to getting realized. In the near future, you're going to sell off this subsidiary. So in that case, this exemption is not available and you have to recognize the detail. So these amounts are huge. You see, if a company like Tata Motors, it has hundreds of subsidiaries, every subsidiary is gaining certain profit. And if today if Tata Motors decides that I want to sell off a particular subsidiary, Imagine the amount of detail that will be debited in the consolidated financial statements of Tata Motors due to this provision. And always remember, this is all about CFS what we are talking. No adjustment will come in the standalone financial statements because the consolidation is not happening in the standalone financial statements. Second example, here we discuss the example of a subsidiary. What if it is an associate? I have an investment value of 1000. My associate has earned a profit of 200, which is my share. I mean, my part of the profit is 200. So what is the value of investment appearing in CFS? It is 1200. What is appearing as value? Detail is there. Detail is arising in this case. Now, whether to recognize this detail or not to recognize. What are the two conditions? Am I controlling the timing of reversal? What does control mean? More than 50% shareholding. It is my associate. I have only 20% shareholding. Am I controlling the timing of reversal? No, I am not controlling the timing of reversal. The first condition itself is not getting satisfied, and accordingly, I have to recognize detail in my consolidated financial statements on the investment value on the amount of rupees 200. So these are the classic cases which get covered in Ind AS, which were never getting covered under your Indian GAAP scenarios. Second case, what if these are losses? What if these are loss scenarios? What if the associate made a loss of rupees 200 due to which my investment value reduced to 800 rupees? The standard says, the standard also agrees that there is a scenario where DTA has arisen. But what to do? Whether to recognize this DTA or not to recognize this DTA. For this also standard has two conditions. You recognize DTA only if, please understand the difference. Previous case was do not recognize the detail if these two conditions are getting satisfied. And these conditions are recognize DTA only if taxable profits are available against which this temporary difference can be used. So in future, there will be certain taxable profits against which this DTA will be set off. And the probability that the temporary difference will reverse in the near future is foreseeable. There is a foreseeable probability that this temporary difference will reverse in the near future. Again, let's understand by way of an example. Now, in case of investment in associates joint ventures, there is always a capital gain what arises as per the income tax. So there should be a probability that for this losses, there should be a probability that capital gains would arise in the near future to set off this capital losses. If there is no probability that such capital gains will arise in the future, then you do not recognize a DTA. This is a standard condition for any kind of DTA. Previously also we read this condition. There should be a probability that the gains should be there to set off this deferred tax asset, to set off these losses. There should be gains in the future. And the second condition is probability that this temporary difference should be will be reversed in the near future. What does it mean? You will recognize DTA only if in the near future you're going to sell off this associate. If in the near future you're not going to sell off this associate, you will not recognize the DTA. I hope I'm clear on these two examples. Both the DTL as well as DTA as the condition of the temporary differences should reverse in the near future. So you go on to the recognition of this deferred tax only if in the near future either you're gonna sell off the subsidiary or subsidiary is gonna pay any kind of dividend for the purpose of gains. So these are the cases which are there in the Ind AS which are not there under the Indian GAAP. One more case. Deferred tax on fair valuation in a business combination. These are all complex cases. Please try to understand. In business combination, as per Ind AS 103, which we are going to cover in detailed manner tomorrow, but let's understand the principle. In Ind AS 103, there is a mandatory requirement that whenever you're doing a business accounting, business combination accounting, the assets and liabilities have to be acquired at fair value. So there is no concept of book value when you're doing the merger accounting or called as business combination accounting in the new standards. So whenever you're accounting for the business combinations, Each assets and liabilities acquired have to be recognized at fair value in the books of the acquirer. So, for example, if my land is at 100, appearing in the book value of the acquiring company, in that cases the book value is 100 rupees, correct? I am acquiring that company, so I'll fair value the assets and liabilities acquired. So suppose the fair value of the land is rupees 120. So in short, the fair value is rupees 120 at which I have accounted in my books of accounts. So directly the land is appearing at 120 in your books. So what will happen of this 20 rupees gain? You will have to recognize a deferred tax liability on this 20 rupees gain. Okay, so even in business combination accounting, each asset and liability have to be recognized at fair value. So whatever is the fair value difference on each such component, there will be a deferred tax liability or there will be a deferred tax asset. Okay, I hope it is clear. Why to do the fair value accounting, how to do it, that we'll discuss in detail tomorrow. But please understand the standard concept that on each fair value component, there will be a detail or a DTA. I understand the logic behind it. Whenever the company which was getting acquired, suppose X company, I'm acquiring the company X. Company would have recognized the deferred tax asset or liability on its book value, right? So whatever was the book value of X, on that component X had recognized asset or liability. When I'm acquiring that company, I'm fair valuing it, and that fair value is becoming my value. So that gain should also be accounted as a deferred tax asset or a liability. Okay, I hope all these scenarios are clear. Even if it is not clear on day one, you just go through all these examples in detailed manner, you will understand it better. Because in the first instance, all these cases are new. It might be difficult to digest, but it is easier to understand in the as and when you read it and as and when you practically apply it. Even if you practically apply even one scenario, the concept of this deferred tax will be more clear to you. Okay. Now we'll understand quickly the presentation and the disclosures. The presentation is similar to what was there under the Indian GAAP scenarios. You have to, the deferred tax asset or liabilities, it should mandatorily be a non-current portion. You cannot say that whatever will reverse in the year one, I will recognize it as a current, and whatever rest it is non-current. No. Every deferred tax asset or liability is mandatorily a non-current component. Second, offsetting of DTA or DTL will be allowed only if you have the legal rights to offset. So for example, in short, within your own company, DTA and DTL can be offset. But understand, if it is in a consolidated financial statements, me as a holding company, for me DTL has arose. The subsidiary in subsidiaries books, there is net DTA. You cannot set off these two items. Because you are a separate tax entity, the subsidiary is a separate taxable entity, and you don't have a legally enforceable right to set off this deferred tax asset and a deferred tax liability. Third, and the classic disclosure required under Ind AS is a tax rate reconciliation. So in your notes to the financial statements, you have to disclose the tax rate reconciliation. What does this mean? If your accounting profit is 1,000, if your accounting profit is 1,000 and the tax rate applicable to your company is 25%, in that cases, the tax expenditure should be is equal to 250 crores. If your profit is 1,000 crores, your tax expenditure should be 250 crores. So tax expenditure means your current tax as well as your deferred tax should be 250 crores. And if it is not 250 crores, what are such reconciling items due to which it is not 250 crores? So it might be incomes chargeable in the next years, expenditure not allowed as deduction, which will be allowed in the future years. There might be tax rate differences. So whenever you compute this tax rate reconciliation, even your mistakes might get identified. Where you should have recognized a deferred tax, but you didn't recognize. This tax rate reconciliation is a very important thing, but which has to be disclosed in the financial statements. So you have to reconcile it to the penny you have to reconcile. You cannot say that rest is other items. I cannot identify what is the difference. If there are other items in your tax rate reconciliation, that means you have made a certain mistake in the computation of current tax or in the computation of deferred tax. your tax rate reconciliation should tally to penny to penny. Then unrecognized deferred tax assets. So whatever are your unrecognized deferred tax assets should be recognized, should be disclosed in your financial statements. And your major components of tax should be disclosed in your financial statements. So if you recognize deferred tax liability, so the major components such as property, plant and equipment, your provision for gratuity, for on whichever components you have recognized the deferred tax, you should disclose it in your financial statements. So this is about the disclosures required. We'll just quickly have an overview of what is differences between Indian GAAP and Ind AS, and then we will open the lines for your questions. As we have discussed, whenever we were discussing each and every concept, the overall approach under this Ind AS is the balance sheet approach. That is why you compute the tax base of an asset and tax base of a liability. Then intra-group transactions, never deferred tax was recognized under Indian GAAP. Deferred tax on business combination was never done under Indian GAAP. Recognition of deferred tax asset under Indian GAAP, it has virtual certainty. Under Ind AS, it has probable. Then tax rate reconciliation was never required. Here you have to reconcile your tax rate. Unrecognized detail in so you have to also show what is the unrecognized component of detail. Due to whatever scenario, if you have not recognized a detail, you have to disclose it in the financial statements. Which will be those scenarios? These subsidiary scenarios what we discussed in the Excel sheet. So if on such scenarios you have not recognized a detail, you have to disclose it in the financial statements. All right, these cases, the profits appearing in the CFS where it is a holding company and a subsidiary company, you have to disclose it in the CFS. And the investments, investment in associate, investment in joint venture, investment in subsidiary company, what we discussed as a special consideration, that also is different under Ind AS, which was not there under Indian GAAP. So I hope I have tried to simplify the standard, which is for which the special considerations are one which is difficult. But I hope whenever you practically apply, this would be of help to you, and will open the lines for the questions. I'll just try to read on your questions and resolve as many as possible. And if you require any further detailed clarification, we can obviously connect through my mobile number through WhatsApp, or you can email me your queries. I've just displayed my mobile number and my email ID. Just a minute, I'll just download your queries. So we'll discuss the queries one by one. So we'll go from last to the first because the recent concepts we have discussed. Please explain an example of tax rate reconciliation. So you will also get a better idea. You can refer any annual report, but I'll just give you an example. For example, if there are any permanent differences, only the permanent differences should form a part of your tax rate reconciliation. Always remember. For example, if there are income tax penalties paid which are debited to your P&L, penalties are never allowed as deduction for a tax purposes. So you might not have recognized a deferred tax over it. Since you have not recognized a deferred tax over it and it is not available as deduction, that might form a part of your tax rate reconciliation. So any such items on which you have neither recognized a deferred tax and it is a permanent difference will form a part of tax rate reconciliation. Second thing is, if every item, second is, for example, last year my tax rate was 25%. This year it is 30%. For all the components of deferred tax, the rate has changed from 25% to 30%. So change in tax rate is also a reconciling item in your tax rate reconciliation. For a complete example, you can download any annual report and you can refer in the disclosures what is the tax rate reconciliation disclosed. So what are the disclosures required for Ind AS 116? So these disclosures are similar to what are required under the other standards. So you disclose the right of use asset, amount of right of use asset, the depreciation on the right of use asset. You also disclose the interest charged on the lease liability, the amount of lease liability, what are the pending payments. So there are no special disclosures as such. but your bare minimum disclosures are there. Here it is not only about the Ind AS 116, the cognizance of financial instruments also come into the picture, and disclosures of financial instruments are also applicable. You disclose how did you identify a lease, what are the bases in which you identified a lease, did you so these theoretical disclosures are more in Ind AS 116, and so these are all the disclosures there. To which companies lease is applicable is no, every company to whomever Ind AS is applicable, they have to apply Ind AS 116. Then another question is, if a 5-year lease contract has auto renew clause for 1 year, should the asset and liability be recorded for 5 years or 6 years? Now this depends upon who has that auto renewal clause. For example, if I am the lessee, I have the auto renewal clause, but that auto renewal clause has to be approved by the lessor. Unless lessor approves this auto renewal clause, until and unless my renewal option won't be valid option. In that cases, understand it is not only in my hand whether the lease will be renewed or it will not be renewed. It is also in the lessor's hand whether it will be renewed or not. So in that cases, when even lessor has a right or whether lessor's permission is also required, in that cases, lease tenure will be 5 years. But if the contract says that only lessee has the option to renew it for further 1 year and lessor has to accept that option, lessor does not have a choice. In that cases, you will see what is the probability, whether the lessee has the probability to extend it for further 1 year. If the probability is yes, then you will take the tenure as 6 years. Otherwise, it will be 5 years. Then will ITFG also be discussed? Wherever it was relevant, we have already discussed ITFG. I might not have specifically mentioned it as an ITFG, but wherever it was relevant, I have clarified all the issues considering the clarifications given by ITFG. I'll share the Excel sheet also. Then classified. Right of use asset will be as good as a property, plant and equipment item. So whatever disclosures of property, plant and equipment are given in balance sheet, same everything will be given in the balance sheet also. So right of use asset will form a part of property, plant and equipment. Then routed through OCI, this concept was disclosed, discussed on day 1 in detail. So that is okay, that is covered. What is the treatment of deposit given for hiring assets, like deposit given for hiring a building? The accounting for security deposit is covered in detailed manner in Ind AS 109. We'll discuss whenever we'll discuss Ind AS 109. What about the concepts like amendment of contract disclosures? Please understand every standard. If we need to discuss each and every concept of the standard, I take lectures of 110 hours in total. So if you want to discuss every concept of the standard, it will take almost 110 hours of discussion. So there we can able to cover each and every concept. So here, whatever is really relevant and whatever is practically applicable in majority of the scenarios, such every concept I have tried to cover. I hope I have covered every queries. Whichever are detailed elaboration is required, I'll email it to you. Yesterday also I tried emailing everybody on the email IDs. So whichever are the detailed elaboration are required, I will give it to you on a email. All right, I hope you enjoyed the session and I hope you have understood all the concepts of 116 and Ind AS 12. And please understand, it might be a bit heavy session. Even tomorrow's and day after tomorrow's concepts are a bit of a higher level. But once you understand Ind AS 12 deferred taxes, you understand leases, you understand financial instruments, and you understand revenue consolidation, you are thorough with Ind AS. You will have at least 80% grip over the Ind AS standards. Over to you, Virag. We have completed the session. And hello,
yeah,
Virag.
it's a wonderful session. Yes, I am there. It's a wonderful session. Guys, we have 2 more session for this session and probably 1 more for discussion. So kindly join for the same. Thank you very much. We are ending the webinar now.
Okay, thank you everyone.